This week on Diabetes Connections Type 2, we're going to be talking about GlucosePATH, a new service for doctors that helps them evaluate treatment options for diabetes while looking at all the other medications they're taking in just a couple of seconds. We're also going to hear about a new surprising study about cortisol and diabetes. And this may sound like a different subject, but stay with me here. Disney very recently made some changes to their Disability Access Service program, often referred to as a DAS Pass, at Disney World and Disneyland. My guests will explain why this happened and what it might mean for you. I will also explain how these two guests can talk about all of these issues. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I am your host, Stacey Sims, and I am thrilled to have you here. For a long time, I have done a show all about type 1 diabetes and about people who use insulin. And I started this program because I really feel like people with type 2 need to have similar access to resources. And there's more and more information every single day. But along with all that information and lots of new medications is frankly a lot of confusion, and not just among patients, but among doctors, because every time a new medication comes out to help treat diabetes, and some of them are absolutely amazing, they also have to take into consideration, how is this going to interact with what my patient is already taking? What is their insurance going to cover? How are we going to sort through this? And as many of you know, most people with type 2 in this country do not see an endocrinologist. They see an overworked and very far-stretched general practitioner. So it's hoped that this service called GlucosePATH is really going to make a big difference. It uses computer science and clinical data to evaluate every possible treatment option using information from the patient, information from the FDA, and peer-reviewed journals, and it does it in just a few seconds. So this is the brainchild of my two guests this week, Len Testa and Dr. Bradley Eilerman. I had them both on Diabetes Connections, the original show, a couple of years ago, and I will link up that episode as well if you'd like to kind of hear the beginnings of this, because now healthcare professionals are using it. In fact, you'll hear in the interview, you can tell your doctor to sign up for it. It's free. And Dr. Eilerman also talks about the Catalyst study, which looks at people with type 2 diabetes and measures cortisol. It's a big deal. It was some very surprising results. We're going to be following this one for a while. But we will start by talking about the changes to the DAS Pass. Len Testa is the co-host of the fabulous Disney Dish podcast, and he's the creator of Touring Plans, the app and the service of the Unofficial Guides to Walt Disney World, Disneyland, and Disney Cruise Line. Testa is all about the math of theme parks. His guides are there to maximize the magic, as he says, to make your waits shorter, to save money, but it is all based on calculations from his team. So now it makes a little bit more sense why these two guys got together to create the service that they did. Before we jump in, if going to Disney World isn't on your list, you're not interested in the DAS Pass, I wanted to ask Len about it because having the opportunity to talk to him right around when these changes were made was just a terrific opportunity. But if you don't think that applies to you, go ahead and skip about 10, 11 minutes in, and they will get to GlucosePATH and more stuff that really applies to folks with type 2. But I got to tell you, I urge you to listen to the beginning because you might learn some stuff about getting around these parks better that you didn't know. Our conversation right after this. Let's be honest, managing diabetes takes time, but ordering supplies should be simple. That's why I'm so excited to partner with US Med for this podcast. US Med stands out with their unwavering dedication to your health and well-being. They proudly hold the #1 spot as the distributor for Freestyle Libre systems nationwide, ensuring you have access to cutting-edge diabetes management. I love that they always provide 90 days worth of supplies and fast free shipping, and they accept Medicare nationwide and collaborate with over 800 private insurers. US Med is your trusted partner in diabetes care. Visit usmed.com/Stacey. That's usmed.com/STACEY. Len Testa, Brad Eilerman, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome back to Diabetes Connections, although it's been a while. I'm glad to have you back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, you got it. Lots of concerns in the community over the changes to what's called the DAS Pass at Disney. So before we talk about anything else, let's jump in and talk about these changes. Len, let me start with you. Maybe set up what it is supposed to do in the first place.
Sure. So everyone knows when you go to a theme park, one of the things that you're going to encounter is long lines. And so Disney wants to be as accommodative to guests as they can be. And they have this program called the Disability Access System, which allows guests who meet certain criteria to use a faster line, a shorter line, to get on some of its more popular rides versus standing in line for 3 hours like the rest of us. And so that program has been around for decades in one form or another. But Disney recently announced a set of changes to that based on some patterns of behavior that they were seeing in the parks that maybe wasn't what the program was intended for.
Before we jump into the changes, I recall, I mean, my son's 19, and I think we first took him to Disney when he was 4. But it was different back then, right? Wasn't it more of a front of line pass, and it has changed to something else even before this change?
Right. It's gone through a couple of iterations.
Okay.
More than a decade ago, it was called the Guest Assistance Card, or the GAC, which I think is what you might have had.
Yeah.
Stacey. Now it's called Disability Access Program. Basically, it's the same intent. The mechanics of it are slightly different around how you go about qualifying for this accommodation and then how you use it in the parks. But fundamentally, the idea is shorter lines for people who need it.
How do you use it now? What does it do?
So the way you use it right now is you'll set up a video chat 30 days before you show up in the parks, and you'll talk to a qualified healthcare professional who asks you how your condition prevents you from waiting in line. So there are a couple of important things there. Right off the bat, they don't ask you what specific medical problem you have. They may or may not be allowed to ask that based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, but Disney generally is trying not to ask those questions if they don't need to. And then if you qualify, you get a pass, and it's a virtual pass, so it's on your phone, that allows you to walk up to an attraction that you want to ride, talk to a cast member, an employee who's running the ride, and they'll set up a time for you to come back. When you come back to ride the ride, you get in the shorter line. So it really saves a ton of time for people who need legitimate accommodation. The downside to it, the thing that's been happening, is to get the same service if you don't have a disability, it can cost up to $38 or $39 per person per day. So there's a strong incentive for cheating, Stacey.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the numbers that I've heard and the things that we've counted in the parks lead me to believe that there was a lot of abuse going on. So Disney's had to add additional restrictions to the program starting May 20th in Orlando and then starting in June in California.
Brad, let me bring you in, Dr. Eilerman. Somebody with diabetes, and this really differs person to person. We talk about this a lot because my son, we never asked for the accommodations. I can totally understand why someone would want them. Absolutely. But I don't have experience with it, which is why I say it that way. I'm sure everyone listening would kind of get this, but why would somebody need them, right? You know, talking about high blood sugar in the sun, maybe somebody who's newer, whose kid was just recently diagnosed.
Sure. I think that the heat by far is the biggest concern. I was in Orlando in the parks in August of 23, and the heat index was, I believe, 106. And even as someone who doesn't have diabetes, it was hard to stay outside for more than about 20 minutes at a time. When you take into consideration skin perfusion with regard to things like insulin pumps or even a subcutaneous injection. And then the thing that I would worry about the most is denaturing insulin. If you're wearing an insulin pump, it's sitting in a tube. And at those temperatures, I can't guarantee that the insulin's going to maintain its full efficacy. So that's my by far largest concern in light of the fact that it seems like it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer for longer. I think that's a place, particularly for outside queues, where it's going to be a big barrier. I think the other thought, of course, is, being able to access food in case of a low. So a mutual friend of Len and I, we were at the parks about a year and a half ago, and we were getting ready to get on the Guardians of the Galaxy ride. And before we got on, he handed me a bag of fruit snacks, and he said, "Do you have an accessible pocket? Do you mind carrying this?" I was like, "Sure." And I was kind of wondering why. I'm like, "If you don't mind me asking," I'm like, "This is a pretty short ride. Are you trending low?" He goes, "No, but what if it gets stuck?" And I'm like, "That is smart."
Valid point. Yeah.
So he was thinking ahead and was really on top of things to the point where I thought I was going to be this resource during the trip, but he had it all down. But of course, like you mentioned, with a new diagnosis, you're not necessarily going to have somebody that's thinking that far ahead. So, you have 2 down arrows on your Dexcom and you're halfway through the Rise of the Resistance queue. What are you going to do?
Yeah. Oh, I've been there. I have crazy stories where oh my gosh, we got stuck on the Mummy in Universal, me and my son. And I was like, "What's your blood sugar? How are you?" And of course, I'm the Sherpa. So I could have fed the whole cart, for a week. But I've drilled into him, right here, throw them.
Yeah, you're throwing packets of gummies like, sorry, sir. Yeah, it was for my son.
We've also talked about what happens if you're on a roller coaster. We live near Carowinds.
Oh, yeah.
And, what happens if you are without me and you're on a roller coaster and you get stuck, So, we've gone through, it's not the best thing to do, but I'm always like, if you're worried about going low, disconnect your insulin pump, or suspend it or whatever. But there's all sorts of tips and tricks, but that doesn't, I'm laughing because I could just do a whole show on disasters at theme parks. Maybe I'll do that another time. But for this pass, what about family, right? Isn't there a group thing, a group situation, as I recall from the previous iteration of this?
Yeah, one of the things that the pass allows you to do is bring family members with you. And, it's a theme park, it's a family vacation. You want to be able to bring on the ride with you the people that you came with, right? So Disney's also changing the rules around that a little bit. So the current policy until May 20th is you can bring up to 6 people with you, any 6 people you know. After May 20th in Orlando, it'll be the greater of 4 people or your immediate family. And Disney hasn't actually said yet how they're defining immediate family. My understanding of it is it's basically anybody on your family tree that you have a direct connection to without going through someone else. So your parents, your siblings, your children, and your spouse.
Len, they're not going to be checking for like a birth certificate or a family tree. How are they? I guess they could, I don't know. That's a tough one to enforce.
Well, so it's 4 people or your immediate family. Yeah. So, they could ask for ID, right? And then that gets a little complicated, but then they can look at addresses and on the IDs. And I know
they're not going to want to do that.
No. And I think some of this is like, we're going to tell you what the rules are. We may not enforce them on every single person, but the penalties, if you lie, are severe. So you get kicked out of the parks. You're trespassed, which means you can't come back. You forfeit basically every dollar that you've spent to get there. So they kick you out of your hotel. They get rid of your ticket. Yeah, they're not fooling around. And that tells you the amount of abuse that's been going on it, that they're saying these consequences are what's going to happen. And they're giving everyone fair warning on it. So,
wow. Well, and I like the way you phrased that because the folks that are nervous in the diabetes community are people who need this and aren't going to abuse this. I heard from so many people initially who said this, the bad actors are ruining it for us.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like they are. It sounds like you can still get what you need if you go through the proper channels. Am I being too hopeful?
Disney's said that they're really trying to target a single-digit percentage of the population who have developmental disabilities who need accommodation. That's the core for this service. And I think everything else after that is going to be on a case-by-case basis. The good news is they've outsourced some of this interview process to a healthcare third party, where if you actually need to talk to like a registered nurse or a psychologist, one will be available to you for that. So if you can make a reasonable case for why, so like, Brad's point about, denaturing insulin, if you stand in a long line, if that's your concern, I would absolutely talk about that specific thing, especially if you're going during the couple months of the year. And I mean by that 10, where it's really hot in Florida. If you're going through the 10 months of the year where it's hot in Florida, that would be a concern. Yeah. So
before we move on, I already mentioned Universal, and I know you're here to talk about Disney, but is there a similar program at Universal Orlando?
There is. It's run by a different third-party company, but the setup is essentially the same. It's there to make sure that the people who need the service get the service, and I think that's the big message on it. It's not that the theme parks are trying to make it harder for anyone. The level of abuse of this system is so great that it can't continue the way it is.
Yeah.
And the problem is like the people who actually need accommodation are actually waiting longer than they should because of all of the abuse that's going on. And that's the problem that needs to be solved first.
But bottom line, it sounds like do this in advance.
Do it 30 days in advance. Yeah. As soon as in advance you can do it, go ahead and do it and get it done.
All right. Excellent. And we'll wait and see what happens when they do change it over. We'll start hearing reports and stuff like that. All right. You guys have lots of stuff that you're working on, though, beyond Disney. Although I am going to see you in Orlando, I guess, for ADA. Dr. Eilerman, let me start with you. What's up? What are you guys working on? It can be pretty tricky to travel with insulin, especially if you're going somewhere very cold or somewhere very hot. We have found something that really works well for us, and that is the ViviCap from Temperamed. It keeps your insulin at the exact right temperature, even in the extreme heat or cold, and it works for any insulin pen. Super simple. You just take the cap off your insulin pen and you slide the ViviCap on. No batteries, no charging, no water or ice packs. It lasts for years and gives you 24/7, 365 protection because insulin is very temperature sensitive. ViviCap has a 30-day, 100% money-back guarantee, and it's got a 2-year warranty. Find out more. I've got a link in the show notes for you, or you can go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Tempramed ViviCap logo.
So Len and I continue to work on the GlucosePATH software. So just as a catch up for people who may not be familiar. So Len and I developed software that helps select appropriate medicines for people with type 2 diabetes, taking into account their medical issues, how easy it is to take the regimen. We take cost into account, and we've studied it. We can demonstrate that it improves hemoglobin A1C. We had a project that we ran right up to the pandemic at my healthcare system, and we lowered A1C by 2.1.
Wow.
Yeah, 2.1 points, yeah.
And we did it in a way that reduced medical claims. So we did more and cost less. We're building on that project now. I took on a role in my system where I help operate risk contracts for insurance companies. So what a risk contract essentially looks like is given a population, we are aiming for really what we should be aiming for, which is patients who are not getting sick. So you take on the risk of healthcare costs in exchange for reward if people are not spending money. And so really it's a wellness focus that benefits everyone involved. But in order to do that, you have to distribute sometimes expensive resources to the people that really need it. So we've decided that this would be a good opportunity to run a project again. So Len and I are in the early stages of building something that will be oriented more towards Medicare, which will be a different group of people. And some of the nature of the way that drugs are priced in Medicare makes this a special group.
Is GlucosePATH something that doctors are using? Where is it in the chain?
Interesting you asked that. So we've gone through a lot of learning through the whole process of developing it along the way. And while it remains a tool that can be used at the bedside, what we're finding is that it gets utilized best when we're looking at large groups of people. What we did during the project that we had with Kentucky Medicaid just before the pandemic is we actually had pharmacist partners running the software and then providing the recommendations to the primary care doctors, who then decided to either accept them or reject them. They accepted them in the vast majority of cases, and then the changes were made. And so there we're respecting the time of the patient and the provider, but at the same time, we're doing that deep data dive that gives the ultimate, hopefully, best choice.
We hear so much about semaglutides now and GLP-1s. And are those configured in this project or no?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that the software does is that it evaluates every possible combination of drugs and doses that you could provide at the same time. Like for a typical patient, we might be examining 2 to 5 million viable combinations. The thing that I tell people all the time is that computers are great at number crunching, and we shouldn't ask physicians to solve what is essentially a number crunching problem, right? So doctors are very, very smart, right? No doubt about that. But I doubt that any primary care physician, I doubt that very many of them could even name all the different drugs available and their doses, let alone consider their efficacy, know about cost, know about contraindications and things like that, right? That's memorization of things like that is not what people are good at, but computers are great at it. So that's the advantage of the software. It basically leaves no stone unturned when it comes to examining options.
So when a new drug is approved, you throw it right in.
I have
Brad's process. Actually,
Right. So we build it in based on the clinical trial data that brought it to market. But a great example of this, have you ever heard of a drug called bexigliflozin?
I have not.
Oh, yes. See?
So
Breznavi is the brand name. Yeah.
So it is an SGLT2 inhibitor, so similar to Jardiance, Farxiga, and the like. It was approved a little over a year ago. My system was one of the sites for their cardiovascular trial. So we followed this drug, we brought it along, it did well in the trial, we saw it got approved, and then we didn't hear much of anything about it. I had a patient ask me if I had heard of it before. I'm like, yes, I actually did. I was an investigator in the clinical trial program. I'm like, why do you ask? And he goes, well, I heard you can get it for less than $50. And I'm like, okay. And I typed it into the electronic medical record and I saw I could prescribe it. but I didn't see anything with regard to the formulary that the patient was on. So it ends up that it's really not on any formularies. They are just pricing the drug at less than $50. It's just at a limited number of pharmacies, including Mark Cuban's Cost Plus pharmacy. So they are selling it at 1/10 the price of the popular SGLT2 inhibitors. It's something that the software discovers quite easily, but unless you're hearing about that through word of mouth, you may not know that this drug even exists. This is where we hope that we can overcome barriers that are brought by the fact that the company is not marketing the drug. And the lack of marketing budget, I'm sure, is part of the reason why they can price it so low.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Knowing that the computers are great, you can find these drugs, you can see if they work for the patient. How does the patient access this? Is that something that's in the future? Is this the idea that your physician would say, oh, you have type 2, you have this other condition, you're already taking this medication. Let me look at Brad and Len's magic machine and we will find what's best?
Well, the challenge with that is during our process where we asked for FDA review, they were very particular that this was a provider-oriented tool. Because clinical judgment needs to be applied to the recommendations. So we don't serve as a substitute for clinical judgment, but we serve as more, again, a number cruncher to present the choices in front of the provider, and then they can make the decision about whether it's appropriate for their patient, which is why in all of our projects, we've included an opt-out. The providers aren't asked to force their patients into something that they don't think is appropriate. Right now, it's not oriented to be a patient-facing tool.
No, and I may have asked that the wrong way. I guess what I meant was, can I, as a patient, like my husband has type 2 diabetes, can I say to him, oh, the next time you so see your doctor, ask him to run this computer program? I mean, is it available or is it still in the...
I mean, physicians can sign up for free for it, sure. Yeah, you need, I think you need to sign up, you need an NPI, a provider number. Yeah, but that's it.
Nice.
And if there is a provider that has a lot of interest, one of the idiosyncrasies as far as being able to utilize it well is to have the right formularies loaded. So if there was a provider that was really interested in seeing a formulary that's not listed, let us know and we can do the due diligence to make sure that's loaded in.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so one of the things we did for Brad's project for the risk contracts is basically loading up all of the formularies for all of the risk contracts that are available. And thankfully, it was there were multiple Medicare Advantage plans we had to cover, but they all had the exact same formulary, which is nice.
So tell me about the Catalyst trial.
Sure.
What are these results?
So Catalyst is a trial that started just several months ago, and it was essentially asking the question of patients that have difficult to control type 2 diabetes, here defined as a hemoglobin A1C of 7.5 or greater on at least 3 non-insulin medicines, insulin and another non-insulin medicine, or 2 diabetes medicines and 2 antihypertensives. Is there something else going on? In this case, specifically looking at excess levels of the hormone cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone made by your adrenal gland. It's part of your stress response. And it's a lot of what drives things forward when you have elevated glucoses if you're experiencing a stressor. So you're having an argument or you're a student going through exams. So
you're living in 2024.
Right.
Yes, of course. And
how are we not all enrolled in this?
Right.
Yeah.
So cortisol is your natural steroid. The glucose response to cortisol is going to be the same as in excess levels as you would have if you had a steroid shot or a prednisone for asthma, for example. And so glucose can go quite high. This is well known in a condition known as Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's syndrome for a long time was thought as something that certainly happens, but is very rare and often caused by things like tumors of the adrenal gland or pituitary gland. And so it's something that people thought of, but they thought of the more extreme versions of Cushing's syndrome where there's a lot of physical features. So round face, weight around the abdomen, very thin arms and legs. What, though, has been observed in other trials, largely in Italy, is that rates of high cortisol are much, much higher than was thought previously. But these were all retrospective studies. And so for the first time, we wanted to take a large number of patients proactively and say, given this particular profile, so someone who's having a difficult time controlling their glucose, do they have abnormal amounts of cortisol? And people were guessing is what the rates were going to be. Now, right now, the rates of Cushing's syndrome are quoted to be, with regard to annual incidence rates, so new cases, somewhere around 40 or 50 per million. So not a lot.
Yeah.
And so if you ask the question, well, how often would you expect to see this in people that have some physical manifestations in terms of high glucose, but not other physical manifestations like the round face or the weight around the abdomen, more than what you would expect in the patient population of type 2 diabetes as a whole? And I thought the rate was going to be somewhere around 2 to 5%. And I thought that sounded tremendously high compared to the 50 per million.
Yeah, because 50 per million is that's like one every 20,000.
Yeah. And again, that's the incidence, not the prevalence, but still, it wouldn't add up to a prevalence that's even 2 to 5%.
Yeah, no, you're way off. Yeah.
So I was super interested in participating. There was some very well-known endocrinologists involved. A guy named Dan Einhorn's running the program, an endocrinologist named Ralph DeFranzo, who's extremely well-known in the diabetes world as an investigator. I've known Dan for a few years. He invited me in. I accepted very excitedly. So we were guessing, and Dan was saying he thought it was going to be 10 to 15%. I'm like, Dan, it's not going to be that high. 2 to 5%, though, will still be groundbreaking. In the winter, we got about 700 patients in, and the results were so striking, they actually had to release a press release to the community because it was considered significant enough that it may impact their stock.
And the rates affects the patients.
The rates were 24.
They're up there too.
Sorry. Yeah. We'll stop.
No, the rates were 24%.
24.
24%. And it's consistent.
You're only off by a factor of 10, Brad. You were close.
So I was seeing it, and the other investigators were seeing it. We didn't have the pooled results. We were talking amongst ourselves like, this is insane. This is nothing what we thought it was going to be. The only reason why I can talk about this at all is because they had the press release. But those of us who were investigators were glad that we could talk at least about what was seen up until February. So they continued to compile the results. We enrolled the last few patients just a few days ago. So the study's now closed. We have roughly 1,000 people. We are going to be presenting the first phase of the study, which is just the prevalence data at ADA. So we're on the last day. I am so excited to see the results presented, and we have more details that I think will be very compelling when people see them. I think what it really emphasizes is that when you are treating someone with type 2 diabetes and you're running into challenges, you really have to consider a lot of things beyond just the fact that someone may not be following a treatment plan. We fall into kind of an unfortunate paradigm where we blame patients for chronic diseases. And I tell people all the time, the most important thing that I decided to do, and I can tell you exactly when I made that decision, but it was to believe patients. I don't know if you ever watched the TV show House, but the mantra of House is that everyone lies.
Right.
And while I can see how that's a good tagline for a TV show, it's not necessarily great medicine. And I remember I was moonlighting at the VA as a fellow, and I was seeing a guy in the emergency room, and he came in and he was complaining about low back pain, and he was looking for some relief, and opioids had relieved it in the past. And in my mind, I was thinking, here's some guy looking for opioids. And I got into his chart and I saw that he had just gotten back from Iraq, and he had an IED that had gone off next to his vehicle, and he had gotten a medical discharge. And then I really realized how cynical I had become through the whole process. And I decided that that's just not the way I wanted to be. It wasn't good for patients. It wasn't good for my own mental health. And that doesn't mean that, again, you take everything as the absolute straightforward words from a patient's mouth, but you have to assume that everybody's coming from a good place.
I think type 2 diabetes especially, people get that diagnosis and they're so reluctant to ask for help, share anything, because in their head, they're saying, I need to eat better and exercise more, and this will all go away. And it's not the case. I mean, it is for some lucky people, but you see these medications and the effects that they can have, and they're absolutely incredible. I got to tell you, I'm not that surprised. I mean, I don't know anything about cortisol, and obviously I'm far from a healthcare provider, but what I have learned in 17 years in the type 1 community is just how much we don't know about what diabetes does to other hormones. But knowing that it's not just about insulin in the pancreas. There's so much more going on. But then a dumb question, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself because you haven't even finished the study yet. What do you think we would do for something like that? Is this a treatment then to try to get the levels of cortisol to go down?
So what we're doing in the Catalyst trial is we have a phase 2, which is ongoing right now. And in phase 2, we're introducing a medication that blocks the effect of cortisol. So the levels themselves don't go down, but we prevent the cortisol from fully binding to the receptor. And so the impact on cortisol, on the glucose, and on some other clinically relevant factors go down. It's going to be very interesting to see if treating the underlying condition causes a substantial improvement in blood glucose. And so that will go on for the next several months. And then hopefully at this time next year, we may have some news about what happens when we're actually able to block the cortisol.
That's really exciting. That's great.
Yeah.
All right. Before I let you go, got to circle back to Disney. We will all be in Orlando for ADA, and then I'll be back in July for Friends for Life. Len, I haven't been to Disney in a long time. I go every year to Coronado Springs to go to this convention. I rarely venture in the parks. It's hot. It's a huge convention and I'm tired. What should we go to this year, though? I mean, this is July, so I guess looking ahead to see a few things are opening, right?
Right. So the big attraction that should be open by the time ADA happens is this thing in the Magic Kingdom called Tiana's Bayou Adventure. It's the story of Princess and the Frog in the old ride that was known as Splash Mountain. That's the big thing. But recently they've opened up a thrilling roller coaster called Tron Light Cycle Run, also in the Magic Kingdom. And then over in Epcot, they've got 2 new rides, Guardians of the Galaxy, which is a indoor roller coaster that is supposedly the longest indoor roller coaster in the world. And also Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, which is a family ride that takes you through the Ratatouille movie from Pixar, which is adorable. Really, really fun.
I love it all. I love it. Disney Dish is such a great show. So we can get all our tips and tricks. Oh, I listen to you guys all the time. Any advice? I mean, I know people are going to go through the new disability services pass and use that advice. But yeah, any like little thing that helps you that you wouldn't mind sharing?
I mean, the big thing that I tell people is to have a plan, right? The last thing you want to do is show up at the parks, walk in past the turnstiles and then try and figure out what you want to do. So you want to get there as early as possible. You want to know which rides you absolutely must see. And if it's a popular ride, the thing is probably to go there first in the day or last, right? So that's the best general advice. And obviously, you and I could probably talk for hours about.
We have a whole show. You don't need
the three of us can actually talk about strategy for days. But yeah, that's the basics. Show up and have a plan. Yeah.
Have a plan. I'm sure you've been to every single stitch, and Brad, you too, of the parks. You've been to the Dolly Lounge over in Coronado Springs, right?
Oh yeah, it's lovely. Yeah,
isn't that nice?
Dolly Lounge. Yeah, I like Coronado a lot. I like also I like Barcelona, the bar in the basement. It's very colorful.
Yes, very colorful.
Barcelona.
But I wanted to ask you because I was in there and I can't remember what the name of it is. It's Salvador Dali, but that's not the name of the lounge.
It's the Dahlia Lounge.
Dahlia Lounge. But there's another, like a Kronos Lounge, right? Is there like
the
a
Kronos
secret?
Lounge is it's
like the partner. I had a great night. The bartender and I sat and talked all night and he told me all about this, but he couldn't get me into the Kronos Lounge.
So it's the lounge for the concierge level of Coronado Springs. I think it's actually the best value, the best club level value in Walt Disney World. It's the least expensive way to get a private lounge. So, and the great thing about that is, like, let's say you're bringing a family of 4, 5, or 6 people, right? Everyone's going to have a slightly different eating schedule. So the advantage of having access to this lounge is that if a couple of kids are hungry, everyone doesn't have to schlep all the way down to a restaurant. Eat or not, right? So you just send the kids over to the lounge, have them grab whatever they want, and maybe they'll bring you back a couple of M&Ms or a snack or something too, right? Or an apple, a healthy apple, whatever whatever you decide, right? Yeah.
Right. Also sounds like a great plan. If as you listen, if you're going to Friends for Life and you would like your favorite podcaster to hang out with you a little bit longer, maybe get me a pass to the Kronos Lounge. We can hang out and have a good time.
But I really do think it is the best club level lounge in Walt Disney World. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I will definitely be following up with both of you. Obviously, some different priorities here, but we'll talk again, hopefully at ADA. Maybe we can get an update on this as the report comes out. I mean, this Catalyst just sounds phenomenal. And I really appreciate you keeping me in the loop with that. And I'll link up all the information about your podcast, Len, if people do have questions. I know you've done episodes on this as well. Oh, of course. But thank you so much. It's great to catch up. I really appreciate you both being here. And I hope to talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys soon.
I'm going to link up more information about GlucosePATH and, of course, about the Catalyst study. But if you want your doctor to take advantage, it is a free service. I will link up some information on how you can do that. And I will be seeing both of these gentlemen over the summer to get more information about what they're doing. So if you have any questions, please hit me up, Stacy@diabetes-connections.com. Thanks as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacy Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacy Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.